The smell hit them first. 70 years of undisturbed earth, mixed with something else. Something that made the archaeological team from Nishiki's Board of Education pause at the entrance to the tunnel. It was November of 2015, and they had just broken through the final seal of concrete that had hidden these passages since August of 1945. The flashlight beams cut through darkness that had been absolute for 7 decades. On the walls, someone had painted characters in fading black ink. Instructions. Diagrams. And there, scattered across a metal desk in what appeared to be an operations room, papers. Training documents. Letters. A pilot's manual, its pages curled with moisture but still legible. The team leader, Takeshi Yamamoto, picked up one of the documents with gloved hands. His voice, when he finally spoke, was barely a whisper. They left everything. They just walked away. This was the Hitoyoshi Naval Air Base at Nishiki, and it held secrets that the Imperial Japanese Navy had intended to take to the grave. But we need to go back. Back to November of 1943, when the first surveying team arrived in this landlocked valley in southern Kumamoto Prefecture. The war was not going well for Japan. The Americans had taken Guadalcanal. The tide in the Pacific had turned. And now, the Imperial Navy needed somewhere safe. Somewhere hidden. Somewhere to train pilots for a mission that would redefine the meaning of sacrifice. Nishiki seemed perfect. Tucked between mountains, nearly equidistant from naval bases along Kyushu's east, west, and south coasts, the small farming town offered both secrecy and strategic positioning. The locals watched with a mixture of curiosity and dread as hundreds of workers descended on their quiet valley. By April of 1944, a 1,500-meter runway sliced through rice paddies. Barracks materialized. A headquarters building rose from the earth. And then the pilots began to arrive. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Lieutenant Ichizo Hayashi was 19 years old when he first saw Nishiki. He had been a student at Kyoto Imperial University, studying philosophy, when his graduation was accelerated and his draft notice arrived. In his diary, discovered decades later among his family's possessions, he wrote, "The mountains here remind me of home. I find myself wondering if that is deliberate. If they chose this place knowing we would see our childhood in every ridge and valley. Perhaps it makes what comes next easier. Or perhaps it makes it unbearably harder." The training at Nishiki in those early months followed conventional patterns. Young men learned to fly the Yokosuka K-5Y, the red-painted biplane affectionately called the Akatanbo or red dragonfly. They practiced formations, navigation, basic combat maneuvers. The sound of engines became the valley's constant companion. Farmers tending their fields would look up to see the biplanes wheeling against the sky, and they would think of their own sons, and they would return to their work with heavier hearts. But by October of 1944, everything changed. The word takotai began to appear in orders. Special attack units. And with it came a new kind of training. Or rather, the absence of training. Sergeant Daikichi Arakawa, stationed at the similar training base at Chuchiura, would later recall the brutal reality of kamikaze preparation. "We were struck on the face so hard and frequently that our faces were no longer recognizable," he wrote in his memoir. "I was hit so hard that I could no longer see and fell on the floor. The minute I got up, I was hit again by a club." This was called building our fighting spirit. But what it built was something else entirely. A numbness. A separation from ourselves. At Nishiki, the training compressed time itself. Where conventional pilots received 500 hours of flight instruction, kamikaze pilots received 40 to 50. Where normal training took months, kamikaze training took 7 days. 7 days to learn takeoff. 7 days to learn formation flying. 7 days to learn how to die. The training manual recovered from the Nishiki tunnels in 2015 outlined the process with chilling precision. Day 1 through 3, takeoff procedures and basic aircraft control. Day 4 through 5, formation flying with escort aircraft, as kamikaze pilots would not navigate themselves to targets. Day 6 through 7, attack approach techniques. 3 methods were taught. The high-altitude steep dive, beginning above 19,200 feet. The low-altitude approach, skimming the ocean at 150 feet to avoid radar. And the medium glide approach, depending on cloud cover and darkness. One page in the manual, its corners still sharp despite the decades, bore a heading that translated simply as the final moment. The instructions were clinical: do not close your eyes as you approach the target. Closing your eyes will cause you to miss. This wastes your life without purpose. Keep your eyes open. Aim for the ship's waterline if approaching low. Aim for the flight deck if diving from altitude. Do not close your eyes. In the margins of this page, someone had written in pencil, "How do they know we will close our eyes?" Have they tested this? They had not needed to test it. They knew. They knew what the human body does when confronted with the certainty of death. They knew about the involuntary flinch, the desperate hope that darkness might somehow provide escape. And so they included it in the manual, this reminder that even in dying, these young men needed to overcome their own humanity. The Americans bombed Nishiki twice in early 1945. The attacks were not particularly damaging, but they revealed the base's vulnerability. And so the Navy made a decision. They would take the operation underground. Between February and May of 1945, hundreds of workers, many of them conscripted students and local laborers, dug into the sandy earth of the tablelands surrounding the base. The soil was perfect for tunneling, soft enough to excavate quickly but stable enough to support underground structures. They created a network that extended across more than 36,000 square meters. Operations rooms. Communications centers. A large torpedo preparation area, though they were landlocked and no torpedoes would ever be assembled there. The irony was not lost on anyone. Storage rooms. Barracks. Everything a functioning military base required, hidden 20 meters beneath the surface. The planes themselves could not be hidden underground. Instead, they were dispersed into the surrounding forests and hills. Barracks and hangars were left standing above ground, empty decoys to absorb American bombs while the real work happened below. Lieutenant Hayashi's diary entries from this period grew shorter, more fragmented. March 2nd. We moved underground today. The air is thick. Cannot see the sky. Dreamed of my death in a fierce battle last night. My only wish is to die for the Emperor. And then, 3 days later, cannot stop thinking of Mother. When I think of her, I cling to life. This is weakness. Must eliminate this weakness. The psychological preparation was perhaps more brutal than the physical training. Pilots were given a manual that detailed how they were supposed to think. How to prepare their minds. How to attain spiritual readiness for death. One section advised, keep your health in the very best condition. You must be strong to accomplish your mission. Another reminded pilots that they could turn back if they could not locate a target, that they should not waste their life lightly. But this created an agonizing paradox. You were being trained to die, yet told not to waste your life. You were being prepared for suicide, yet instructed to maintain hope of survival if conditions were not perfect. The cognitive dissonance was intentional. It kept pilots from giving up entirely, from simply crashing their planes into the ocean rather than even attempting to reach the enemy fleet. But it also meant that every single day became an exercise in holding two contradictory truths simultaneously. In the underground barracks at Nishiki, the pilots created their own small rebellions against despair. They read. They read voraciously. Western philosophy, Japanese poetry, banned literature smuggled in by sympathetic officers. Daikichi Arakawa, writing about his own base, recalled, "We tried to live with 120% intensity, rather than waiting for death. We read and read, trying to understand why we had to die in our early 20s. We felt the clock ticking away towards our death, every sound of the clock shortening our lives." At Nishiki, they formed a small library in one of the underground rooms. Books were passed hand to hand, read by flashlight, discussed in whispers. French novels appeared. German philosophy. Translations of American writers. Each book was a small act of rebellion, a reminder that the world extended beyond this valley, beyond this war, beyond the rapidly narrowing corridor of their remaining lives. The Senenbari belts began appearing around the same time. These 1,000-stitch belts were sent from home, sewn by mothers, sisters, wives, girlfriends. Each woman would add a single stitch, walking through neighborhoods and markets collecting stitches from 1,000 different women. The belts were supposed to provide protection, to carry the love and prayers of all those women with the pilot on his final flight. Lieutenant Hayashi received his in April of 1945. He described it in his diary, "Mother sent the Senenbari today. I can feel the texture of each stitch. 1,000 women prayed for me. 1,000 women who do not know me placed their hope in this cloth. I am supposed to wear this when I fly. But I wonder, do they know what they have prayed for? Have they prayed for my protection in accomplishing the mission? Or have they prayed for my survival? And which would I choose, if I could choose?" The question remained unanswered. His diary entries stopped in late April. Whether he flew a mission and died, whether he was waiting for his turn when the war ended, or whether he simply stopped writing is unclear. His name does not appear on the memorial lists at Chiran or Kanoya, the major kamikaze bases. He may have been one of the hundreds who trained but never flew. One of the ghosts who survived but never really left Nishiki. By July of 1945, the base was preparing for Operation Katsugo, the defense of the Japanese home islands against the expected American invasion. Every available plane was being stockpiled. Fuel, desperately scarce throughout Japan, was being hoarded for one final, massive kamikaze assault. The plan called for waves of 300 to 400 planes, launched at a rate of 1 wave per hour, to swarm the invasion fleet. In the underground operations room at Nishiki, maps covered every wall. The southern coast of Kyushu was marked with predicted landing zones. Kagoshima Bay, where the Americans would need a deep-water anchorage. The beaches near Miyazaki. Each location had been studied, analyzed, assigned specific squadrons of kamikaze pilots. The training intensified. Pilots practiced their approaches relentlessly. Low-altitude runs across the valley, pulling up just before impact with imaginary targets. High-altitude dives, engines screaming, pulling out at the last moment to simulate the trajectory they would follow into an American carrier or battleship. Except, of course, they would not pull out. That was the entire point. One document recovered from the underground archives at Nishiki was a letter, never sent. It was found tucked into a training manual, written on the back of a supply requisition form. The handwriting was careful, precise. It began, "To whoever finds this, I am writing because I cannot write to my family what I truly feel. I cannot tell my mother that I am afraid. I cannot tell my father that I believe this mission is futile. I cannot tell my sister that I am angry. Angry at the admirals who will never fly these missions. Angry at the emperor, though speaking this is treason. Angry at myself for my weakness. And so I write to no one. To the future. To whoever stands in this room after we are gone. Know that we were not all heroes. Know that some of us were just afraid." The letter was unsigned. The author's identity will never be known. But the words, preserved by chance in the dry air of the sealed tunnels, speak across the decades with startling clarity. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. On August 6, 1945, the atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima. On August 9, Nagasaki. On August 15, the Emperor's voice crackled over radios throughout Japan, announcing the surrender. At Nishiki, the pilots and ground crew gathered around the radio in the underground communications room. Many of them wept. Some with relief. Some with shame. Some with a complicated mixture of both. The order came to stand down. To abandon the base. To destroy sensitive documents and await instructions from occupation forces. But something strange happened at Nishiki. The documents were not destroyed. The pilots' letters, left on their bunks and in their belongings, were not burned. The training manuals, with their careful diagrams of death, were left on desks and shelves. The operations maps remained pinned to the walls. It was as if, in that moment of surrender, everyone simply walked away. Walked away from the tunnels, from the underground world they had inhabited, from the future they had been preparing for. They emerged into August sunlight, and many of them never looked back. The locals knew about the tunnels, of course. Within weeks of the surrender, curious villagers began exploring. But they assumed the underground facilities were simply air raid shelters. That was the story that circulated. That was what they told themselves. And so the tunnels became storage. Rice was kept there. Farming equipment. Old furniture. The detritus of ordinary life slowly filled the spaces that had been designed for extraordinary death. For 70 years, the secret held. The above-ground ruins of the base were visible, of course. The cracked runway, slowly being reclaimed by vegetation. The skeletal remains of the barracks. The training plane, a K-5Y Akatanbo, sitting rusted but recognizable in a field. But the full extent of the underground facilities, their purpose, their scope, remained hidden. Until 2015, when the Nishiki Board of Education began a proper archaeological survey. They had found a copy of the original floor plans in a municipal archive, a document that had somehow escaped destruction. The plans showed the tunnel network in detail. And they showed something else. Rooms that the locals had never found. Sealed chambers, walled off deliberately in the days after the surrender. The archaeological team worked carefully, methodically. They mapped the known tunnels first, comparing them to the floor plans. Then they began looking for the sealed sections. Months of work went into locating the precise spots where walls had been built to hide entire rooms. And in November, 70 years and 3 months after the last pilot walked out of Nishiki Base, they broke through. The operations room was exactly as it had been left. Dust covered everything, but beneath the dust, time had stopped in August of 1945. The maps on the walls showed American approach vectors, defensive plans that would never be implemented. The desk held training schedules for pilots who would never fly. And scattered throughout the room, in drawers and filing cabinets and simply left on surfaces, were the documents. Personal letters. Official manuals. Training records. Diary entries that pilots had written and left behind, unable or unwilling to take them home. One team member, Yuki Tanaka, later described the moment: "We expected military documents. We expected strategic plans. What we didn't expect was the humanity." These young men had left pieces of themselves here. Not just their words, but their doubts, their fears, their hopes. Reading those letters, you realize these were not fanatics. These were students, farmers, sons and brothers who found themselves in an impossible situation. Among the documents was a training class roster from July of 1945. 24 names. 24 young men, the youngest 17, the oldest 24. Next to each name, someone had written notations in pencil. Deployed August 2nd. Deployed August 7th. Standby. 7 of the names were marked standby. 7 young men who were scheduled to fly after August 15th. 7 who were spared by the Emperor's radio broadcast. But what happened to them? That question haunts the Nishiki Museum staff. They have tried to track down the names, to find out what became of those 7 pilots who didn't fly. A few were identified. Most vanished into the chaos of post-war Japan, changing their names, moving to new cities, trying to build lives from the wreckage of their interrupted youth. One man, identified only as KM in the museum records to protect his family's privacy, came forward in 2017 after hearing about the discovery. He had been one of the standby pilots at Nishiki. He was 92 years old when he visited the museum, walking slowly through the preserved tunnels with a cane, accompanied by his grandson. The museum curator described the visit: "He was silent for most of the tour. Then we came to the barracks area, and he stopped. He pointed to a specific bunk. "That was mine," he said. "I slept there for 3 months, waiting for my turn." He sat down on the bunk, which we had preserved with its original mattress. He put his hand on the rough blanket. And then he said something I will never forget. He said, "I have spent 70 years feeling guilty for surviving. For being spared. Every August 15th, I wonder if I should have been grateful or ashamed. I still don't know the answer." The documents found in those sealed chambers tell a story that contradicts nearly every popular narrative about kamikaze pilots. The Western imagination, shaped by wartime propaganda and post-war films, sees kamikaze as fanatical zealots, eager for death, brainwashed by militaristic ideology. The Japanese post-war narrative, equally simplistic, portrays them as noble sacrifices, young men who willingly gave their lives for emperor and country without hesitation or doubt. The truth, as preserved in the papers scattered across that underground desk at Nishiki, is far more complicated and infinitely more human. Consider the training manual itself. The one recovered in nearly pristine condition, its pages filled with technical diagrams and precise instructions. On page 14, a section titled Psychological Preparation begins with this instruction: the pilot must achieve a state of mushin no mind. Empty the self of desire, fear, and attachment. Become the instrument of the Emperor's will. But in the margins of this page, in different hands, multiple pilots had written their responses. One wrote simply, "Impossible." Another wrote, "I try, but I think of her face." A third wrote something longer, "They ask us to become nothing. But if we are nothing, what are we dying for?" The logic defeats itself. To die for the Emperor requires love of the Emperor. Love is attachment. Attachment is what we must eliminate. So we must eliminate the very thing that makes this sacrifice meaningful. This was the central paradox at the heart of kamikaze training. The pilots were told they needed to embrace death completely, to become one with their aircraft and their mission, to transcend the fear and attachment that defined human existence. But simultaneously, they needed to maintain enough connection to humanity, enough love for family and nation, to actually go through with the mission. Too much detachment and they would simply not care enough to fly. Too much attachment and they would be paralyzed by fear and grief. The training attempted to walk this impossible line. Morning sessions began at 5 o'clock with meditation. The pilots would sit in the underground chambers, cross-legged on thin mats, attempting to achieve the mental clarity their instructors demanded. But meditation, when you know you are meditating on your own death, becomes something else entirely. It becomes a confrontation with mortality so direct that many pilots reported feeling physically ill during these sessions. One letter, written by a pilot named Takashi Nishimura and discovered folded inside a copy of the Hagakure, the samurai text that became required reading for kamikaze pilots, described the experience. "This morning during meditation I could not stop vomiting. The instructor struck me and told me I was weak, that I was dishonoring my family. But I was not sick from weakness. I was sick from clarity. I could see, with perfect clearness, my plane striking the ship. I could see the fire. I could feel the impact. And my body, which does not understand ideology or honor, rebelled. My body, stupid animal that it is, wants to live." The Hagakure itself deserves examination. This 18th century text on Bushido, the samurai code, had been largely forgotten before the militarists revived it in the 1930s. Its most famous line, "The way of the warrior is found in death," became the philosophical foundation for kamikaze training. Pilots were required to read it, to memorize passages, to internalize its lessons. But the Hagakure was written for samurai who might die in battle, not for soldiers who were certain to die. The text assumes survival is possible, even if unlikely. It provides guidance for how to live with honor while accepting that death might come at any moment. The kamikaze pilots, however, were not living with the possibility of death. They were living with its certainty. And so the text, meant as guidance, became instead a source of cognitive dissonance. Multiple copies of the Hagakure were found at Nishiki, and many contained annotations. The The pilots were engaging critically with the text, questioning it, pushing back against its certainties. On one page discussing the warrior's joy in facing death, a pilot had written, "Easy to say when you have already lived a full life." Yamamoto Tsunetomo wrote this in his 60s. I am 19. The training also included practical lessons in what might be called the mechanics of dying. Pilots were instructed on how to write their final letters. There was a formula, a structure they were expected to follow. Begin with expressions of loyalty to the Emperor. Assure parents of your honor and determination. Thank them for their care and teaching. Express no regret. End with confidence in Japan's ultimate victory. The museum at Nishiki has dozens of these letters, both drafts and final versions prepared for mailing. Reading them in sequence reveals the painful process of self-censorship. Early drafts contain honest emotion, fear, sadness, love, doubt. Subsequent drafts progressively remove these human elements, replacing them with the ideologically correct sentiments. The final versions often bear little resemblance to the first attempts. One pilot, whose name has been withheld at his family's request, left 7 drafts of his final letter. The first began, "Mother, I am so afraid. I do not want to die. I am only 20 years old and there is so much I have not done." The final version began, "Mother, I am honored to have been selected for this glorious mission. Please feel pride, not sorrow, for I die in service to the Emperor and the eternal nation of Japan." Between the first and final drafts, you can trace the process by which genuine feeling was systematically erased and replaced with acceptable performance. This was not brainwashing in any simple sense. The pilots knew what they were doing. They were consciously choosing to lie to their families, to present a version of themselves that would be easier for everyone to live with. It was an act of love, in its way. And an act of profound loneliness. The training facility at Nishiki also included what might be called a death preparation room. This space, one of the sealed chambers rediscovered in 2015, contained personal effects that pilots would leave behind before their final mission. Watches. Photographs. Letters they had received from home. Locks of hair cut to be sent back to families. Personal diaries. The practice was that pilots would spend their last night at the base in this room, going through their possessions, deciding what would be sent home and what would be left behind. It was meant to help them achieve the required state of detachment. By physically separating from their possessions, they would separate from their attachments to life. But the room also contained items that were never meant to go home. Hidden behind a loose board in the wall, the archaeological team found a small cache of photographs. These were pictures the pilots could not keep and could not send home because they violated military regulations. Pictures of girlfriends. Pictures taken at parties before the war. Pictures that showed these young men laughing, drinking, being foolish and young. One photograph showed 4 pilots standing with their arms around each other, mugging for the camera. On the back, someone had written, July 4, 1945. 3 weeks before Tanaka's mission. 2 weeks before Sato's mission. 1 week before mine. Yamamoto is still waiting. We are all dead now, even the ones still alive. The psychological pressure at bases like Nishiki was intensified by what can only be described as a campaign of intimidation disguised as training. Officers would regularly gather the pilots for motivation sessions that were actually brutal verbal assaults. They would be told that their families were counting on them, that the entire nation depended on their sacrifice, that failure to embrace death willingly was the ultimate betrayal. Sergeant Arakawa, whose memoir of his time at the Chuchiura Naval Air Base provides one of the few first-hand accounts of kamikaze training, described these sessions. The instructors would select one pilot and spend an hour breaking him down. Calling him weak. Calling his mother weak for raising such a coward. Suggesting that perhaps his family should be informed of his lack of fighting spirit. The goal was to make us more afraid of social shame than physical death. And for many, it worked. This fear of shame, of bringing dishonor to one's family, was perhaps the most effective weapon in the military's psychological arsenal. Japanese society in the 1940s was intensely communal. Individual identity was inseparable from family identity. To refuse a kamikaze mission was not just to save your own life. It was to mark your entire family, potentially for generations, as the family that produced a coward. Several of the letters found at Nishiki referenced this directly. One pilot wrote, "I fly not because I want to die, but because I cannot live with what refusal would do to my parents. My death will be remembered with honor. My survival, if it came from refusing this mission, would be remembered with shame. And so I choose the death that preserves my family's name. I am dying for them, not for the Emperor. But I cannot tell them that." The reality of kamikaze operations, as documented in military records found at Nishiki and other bases, reveals another uncomfortable truth: the missions were far less effective than either wartime propaganda or post-war memory suggests. Of the approximately 4,000 kamikaze pilots who flew missions between October 1944 and August 1945, only about 14% successfully struck their targets. This statistic was carefully hidden from the pilots in training. They were shown films of successful attacks. They were read reports of devastating damage. They were told that a single kamikaze could sink an aircraft carrier, that their deaths would turn the tide of the war. But the reality was that most kamikazes were shot down by American fighter cover, destroyed by anti-aircraft fire, or simply missed their targets due to inexperience and poor training. A planning document found at Nishiki, dated June 19, 1945, reveals that commanders were aware of this. The document analyzes the effectiveness of kamikaze attacks up to that point and concludes that approximately 300 to 400 pilots would be needed to sink a single aircraft carrier, given the actual success rate. But this information never reached the pilots themselves. Imagine being 19 years old, preparing to die, believing your death will be meaningful, will damage the enemy, will protect your homeland. Now imagine learning that your death is statistically insignificant. That you are not a precision weapon but a probability statistic. That the commanders planning your mission know you will likely fail but are sending you anyway because throwing enough bodies at the problem might, eventually, produce results. The pilots at Nishiki did not know this. But some of them suspected. In the training room, on a blackboard that had somehow escaped cleaning in the final chaotic days of the base, someone had written a calculation. The math worked out how many planes would need to be launched to achieve a 50% probability of sinking one destroyer, given observed hit rates. The calculation was pessimistic but accurate. And beneath it, in different handwriting, "We are not warriors. We are bullets. And bullets do not receive funerals." The physical training at Nishiki was minimal by necessity. There were not enough aircraft, not enough fuel, not enough time. Pilots would practice takeoff once or twice. They would fly in formation with more experienced pilots who would guide them to the target zone. And then they would dive. That was the extent of their flight training. Everything else was psychological preparation, ideological indoctrination, and emotional manipulation designed to ensure they would actually go through with it when the moment came. But there was one aspect of the training that was conducted with meticulous care: the maintenance of the aircraft. The mechanics at Nishiki worked with almost religious devotion to ensure that every plane was in perfect condition. This was partly practical: a mechanical failure before the pilot reached the target was a wasted death. But it was also symbolic. The care lavished on the aircraft was, in a sense, care for the pilots themselves. Making sure the plane would fly smoothly, would handle well, would not fail at the critical moment was the only form of protection, of consideration, that anyone could offer to these young men. One mechanic, Saburo Hayashi, kept a diary throughout his time at Nishiki. It was discovered in a box in the underground storage area, wrapped in oiled cloth to protect it from moisture. His entries are brief but revealing. May 2nd. Spent 8 hours on the engine of Lieutenant Akamoto's plane. Perfect compression. Perfect timing. It will not fail him. And then, 3 days later, Lieutenant Akamoto crashed into the ocean 2 kilometers from the target. Shot down by American fighters. Perfect engine. Perfect timing. All meaningless. The diary continues through June and July of 1945, each entry documenting meticulous maintenance followed by notification of the pilot's death. The pattern repeats. Perfect maintenance. Perfect engines. Dead pilots. By early August, Hayashi's entries have become almost nihilistic. Why do I care if the engine is tuned correctly? Why does it matter if the landing gear is in perfect condition when the pilot will never land? I take pride in my work because it is all I can do. But the work itself is meaningless. I am perfecting instruments of suicide. The underground facilities at Nishiki included a small shrine. This was unusual for a military base, but kamikaze bases often included religious spaces. The shrine was simple: a small altar, incense holders, a space for meditation and prayer. The archaeological team found it exactly as it had been left, including offerings that pilots had left behind. These offerings are perhaps the most heartbreaking artifacts in the entire collection. Small toys. A child's wooden top. A school medal. A stone from a home garden. These were talismans, objects of connection to childhood, to innocence, to the time before the war. Pilots would leave them at the shrine, perhaps hoping that the gods would accept these small sacrifices in place of their lives. Perhaps hoping that by leaving these objects of their childhood, they could preserve something of themselves even as their bodies were destroyed. One offering was a small notebook, water-damaged but partially legible. It contained haiku, dozens of them, written in different hands. This was a communal notebook where pilots would write poetry, following the ancient Japanese tradition of expressing profound emotion through the strict 17-syllable form. Many of the haiku deal with death, but not in the way you might expect. They do not glorify death or embrace it. Instead, they mourn what will be lost. One reads, "Cherry blossoms fall before they know their beauty, I too will not know." Another, "Mother's face fading like ink in rain-washed letters, I try to remember." And one that captures the essential loneliness of the kamikaze experience, "We speak of honor but I die alone, afraid words cannot follow." The haiku tradition allowed for emotional expression that direct speech did not. By encoding their feelings in poetic form, the pilots could acknowledge their fear, their sadness, their unwillingness without directly stating it. The form provided a kind of deniability. You were not saying you were afraid. You were writing a haiku that happened to mention fear. The distinction mattered in the oppressive atmosphere of the training base. By late July of 1945, Nishiki was preparing for the expected American invasion. Intelligence reports suggested the landings would come in November. Every pilot at the base, even those who had just arrived and barely knew how to fly, was placed on standby. The plan was to launch everyone, experienced and inexperienced alike, in massive waves when the invasion fleet appeared. The underground operations room's maps from this period show the desperation of the planning. Every potential landing beach was identified. Every approach vector was calculated. But there were simply not enough planes, not enough pilots, not enough fuel. Even if every single kamikaze at every base in southern Japan flew and every single one hit a target, an impossible scenario, they would not stop the invasion. The commanders knew this. But they planned anyway, because to stop planning would be to admit defeat. A logistics document from July 28 shows the reality. Nishiki had 43 planes in working condition. Fuel reserves sufficient for 62 missions. 117 pilots in various stages of training. If the invasion came, the base could launch approximately one wave of 30 to 40 planes, assuming they could scrounge additional fuel. That was it. The entire base, all the underground facilities, all the training, all the psychological preparation, all of it would be exhausted in one morning of desperate, futile attacks. And then the atomic bombs fell. Hiroshima on August 6. Nagasaki on August 9. The pilots at Nishiki received the news through fragmentary reports and rumor. They knew something catastrophic had happened, but the full scale was hidden from them. What they did understand was that the calculus of the war had changed. That something had entered the equation that made all their training, all their preparation, suddenly obsolete. Lieutenant Hayashi's diary, which had been silent for months, has one final entry dated August 12. They say an entire city was destroyed by one bomb. One bomb. We have been preparing to die, one by one, each of us destroying perhaps one ship if we are lucky. And now one bomb destroys a city. I do not know if I feel relief or rage. Our sacrifice has been made meaningless not by failure but by being superseded. We prepared to be bullets. Now we are not even that. We are irrelevant. The surrender came 3 days later. At Nishiki, the commander gathered everyone in the largest underground chamber, the torpedo preparation room that had never prepared torpedoes. They listened to the Emperor's broadcast over the radio. The quality was poor, the Emperor's voice unfamiliar, most Japanese had never heard him speak, the classical Japanese difficult to understand. But the message was clear. The war was over. Different pilots reacted differently. Some wept openly, with relief or grief or both. Some sat in stunned silence. Some became angry, shouting that they should fly anyway, that surrender was dishonor, that they could still strike the Americans. But most simply sat quietly, processing the reality that they were going to live. That the future, which had terminated in a moment of fire and impact, had suddenly reopened. That they would see tomorrow, and the day after, and somehow would need to figure out what to do with all those days they had not expected to have. The commander issued orders to stand down, to prepare to surrender the base to occupation forces, to destroy sensitive documents. But as we know, the destruction was incomplete. Whether this was intentional, a decision to preserve the record for history, or simply the product of chaos and exhaustion, we cannot know. But the result was that when the archaeological team broke through those sealed walls 70 years later, they found history preserved in amber. The immediate aftermath at Nishiki was confusion. Pilots were told to return home, but many had no homes to return to. Cities had been bombed. Families scattered. The entire social order that had produced the kamikaze phenomenon was collapsing. Some pilots stayed at the base for days or even weeks, sleeping in the underground barracks because they had nowhere else to go. Others left immediately, desperate to get away from the place that had been preparing them for death. They walked to the nearest train station, still in their flight suits because they had no other clothes, and tried to disappear into the chaos of defeated Japan. Many changed their names. Many never told their families, or later their children, that they had been kamikaze pilots. The shame of survival, the guilt of being spared, was something they carried silently for the rest of their lives. The base itself was officially decommissioned on September 3, 1945, though American occupation forces did not actually inspect it until October. When they arrived, they found the above-ground facilities abandoned and partially destroyed. They noted the tunnel entrances in their report but apparently did not fully explore the underground network. The tunnels were sealed, whether by American order or Japanese initiative is unclear, and the base was forgotten. The town of Nishiki gradually reclaimed the land. The runway became fields again. The barracks collapsed or were torn down. The above-ground structures disappeared. But underground, sealed in darkness, everything remained. And there it waited for 7 decades. The discovery in 2015 sparked an intense debate in Japan about memory and responsibility. How should these artifacts be preserved? How should this history be taught? The kamikaze phenomenon remains controversial. To some, the pilots were noble sacrifices, victims of American aggression who gave their lives to protect Japan. To others, they were victims of Japanese militarism, young men manipulated and wasted by commanders who knew the war was already lost. The documents from Nishiki complicate both narratives. They reveal young men who were neither fanatics nor simple victims. They were people trapped in impossible circumstances, navigating between propaganda and reality, between ideology and survival, between duty and desire. They were critical thinkers who questioned the mission even as they prepared for it. They were obedient sons who loved their families more than they loved the emperor, though they could never say so. They were afraid, and they went anyway, and that makes their story more tragic, not less. The museum that now occupies part of the Nishiki site takes a careful approach. It presents the artifacts without excessive interpretation. The letters speak for themselves. The training manuals demonstrate the reality of kamikaze preparation without glorifying or condemning it. Visitors walk through the preserved tunnels, seeing the operations room as it was left, reading the words written by pilots who expected to die, and draw their own conclusions. But the museum staff reports that certain reactions are nearly universal. People weep. They weep in the barracks area, imagining young men sleeping there night after night, counting down to their final mission. They weep in the operations room, seeing the maps that plotted deaths. They weep at the shrine, seeing the small toys left as offerings. The artifacts strip away ideology and force confrontation with simple human tragedy. One element of the exhibits is particularly powerful: the roster board. This was found in the operations room, a large wooden board with slots for name cards. Pilots' names would be written on cards and slotted into the board in mission order. The board was never cleared. It still contains the names of the pilots who were scheduled to fly in August 1945. The standby pilots. The ones who would have gone next if the war had continued another week. Museum visitors often stop at this board for a long time. They read the names. They calculate ages. They imagine the moment when these young men learned they would not fly after all, that they would live. Was it relief? Guilt? Confusion? All of the above? The board asks questions it cannot answer. The broader legacy of the kamikaze phenomenon extends far beyond Nishiki. Approximately 4,000 pilots flew suicide missions between October 1944 and August 1945. They sank approximately 50 Allied ships and damaged more than 300. They killed nearly 5,000 Allied sailors. And then it ended, and Japan surrendered anyway, and all those deaths accomplished nothing except to slightly delay the inevitable. The American occupation authorities initially planned to prosecute kamikaze commanders as war criminals, arguing that sending men on suicide missions violated the laws of war. But the trials never happened. Partially because the legal argument was complex. Soldiers die in war, and is ordering a soldier into a situation with 90% casualties really different from ordering one into a situation with 100% casualties? And partially because the occupation authorities decided that dwelling on kamikaze would make reconciliation with Japan more difficult. And so the commanders mostly escaped accountability. Many went on to successful post-war careers in business and politics. Some wrote memoirs in which they portrayed kamikaze as a noble sacrifice forced upon Japan by American aggression. Others said nothing, took their knowledge of the training methods and the psychological manipulation to their graves. The opportunity to fully reckon with what had been done to those young men was lost. The pilots who survived carried their burden differently. Some, like the man who visited the Nishiki Museum in 2017, lived with unresolved guilt. Others managed to build normal lives, to have families and careers, to find meaning in their survival. But almost all of them were reluctant to talk about their experiences. The post-war narrative in Japan oscillated between glorifying kamikaze as heroes and ignoring them entirely. There was little space for the complex reality that they had been manipulated, that they had been afraid, that many had questioned the mission even as they prepared for it. It was not until the generation of kamikaze pilots began dying of old age, in the 1990s and 2000s, that more honest accounts began to emerge. Memoirs were published. Interviews were conducted. And gradually, a more nuanced picture developed. These were not mindless fanatics. They were not necessarily willing heroes. They were ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances, who did what they felt they had to do under impossible pressure. The training documents from Nishiki contribute to this more complex understanding. They show the mechanics of how ordinary young men were prepared for suicide. They reveal the psychological techniques, the social pressure, the manipulation of family loyalty and national identity. But they also reveal resistance, doubt, critical thinking. The human spirit pushing back against ideology even as external pressure forced compliance. One document, found in a sealed file cabinet in the operations room, summarizes perhaps better than anything else what Nishiki represented. It is a letter from the base commander to Naval Headquarters in Tokyo, dated July 18, 1945. It reads, in part, I write to inform you that morale among the pilots remains high and their dedication to the mission unwavering. All are eager to serve the Emperor and are prepared to sacrifice themselves without hesitation. Training continues to produce capable pilots ready for immediate deployment. However, I must also report in confidence that this assessment applies only to external behavior. Internal thoughts, as revealed in confiscated letters and overheard conversations, suggest significant doubt and fear among many pilots. We continue psychological preparation to strengthen resolve, but I fear that if missions are delayed much longer, deterioration of fighting spirit is inevitable. Request immediate deployment of all trained pilots before psychological readiness degrades further. The letter reveals the gap between official narrative and reality. The commanders knew. They knew the pilots were afraid, were doubtful, were being held together by pressure and manipulation rather than genuine conviction. And their solution was not to reconsider the mission but to hurry up and use the pilots before they broke down completely. This letter was never sent. It was found in a desk drawer and signed. Perhaps the commander thought better of admitting the truth to his superiors. Perhaps he feared how such honesty might be received. Or perhaps he simply ran out of time, the war ending before he could finalize his correspondence. But the letter remains, an admission of the reality that everyone involved knew but could not officially acknowledge. The Nishiki Museum now receives approximately 80,000 visitors per year. School groups come. Foreign tourists come. Elderly veterans, both Japanese and American, come to pay respects. The underground chambers have been stabilized and lit, carefully preserved to look as they did in 1945. Visitors can stand in the barracks, sit on the bunks, walk through the operations room, see the maps and the letters and the training manuals. And the response, from Japanese and foreign visitors alike, is remarkably consistent. Horror at what was done to these young men. Sadness for their wasted potential. Recognition of the common humanity that transcends nationality and ideology. The kamikaze pilots are no longer propaganda symbols. They are not political statements. They are simply young men who died before they could live, and their story demands to be remembered with honesty and compassion. The archaeologist who led the excavation, Takeshi Yamamoto, has said, when we broke through that final wall and saw the operations room preserved exactly as it had been left, my first thought was that we had found a tomb. And in a sense, we had. Not the tomb of bodies, but the tomb of futures. All those young men had futures in August 1945. Futures they expected to end in a moment of fire. And then the war ended, and some of those futures were restored. But in this room, in these documents, we found the moment where all those futures hung suspended between life and death. And that moment, preserved by accident and neglect, tells us something essential about what war does to the young. The specific fate of Lieutenant Ichizo Hayashi, whose diary entries have illuminated this narrative, remains unknown. His name does not appear on memorial lists. His family, contacted by the museum, confirmed he survived the war but said he never spoke about his time as a kamikaze pilot. He worked as a teacher in rural Kyushu, never married, and died in 1997 at the age of 71. His diary, found among the documents at Nishiki, was apparently one he could not bring himself to keep or to destroy, and so he left it behind in those underground chambers, a record of weeks when he prepared to die. His final entry, from August 12, contains one more sentence after the one quoted earlier. After expressing his confusion about being made irrelevant by the atomic bomb, he wrote, I suppose I should feel grateful. I will live now. I will see September, and October, and perhaps even next spring. But I do not know how to be grateful for a future I never imagined having. I have spent months preparing for death. Now I must somehow learn to prepare for life. I do not know how to do this. No one trained us for survival. That sentence captures the profound disorientation of the kamikaze pilots who survived. They had been psychologically prepared for death, had achieved some measure of acceptance of their fate, had said their goodbyes and made their peace. And then, suddenly, they were told they would live. It was not the joyous reprieve you might imagine. It was confusing, destabilizing, in some cases even unwelcome. They had been ready. And now they had to become unready. They had to figure out how to want to live again after accepting death. Many never fully managed it. Suicide rates among kamikaze pilots who survived the war were significantly higher than among other veterans. Depression, alcoholism, and social isolation were common. These men had been prepared for one future death and then thrust into another life without any psychological tools to navigate it. They were, in a very real sense, refugees from their own past. The story of Nishiki, then, is not just about the war itself but about its aftermath. It is about how societies cope with the consequences of asking the young to die. It is about memory and forgetting, about what we preserve and what we hide. For 70 years, those tunnels remained sealed, the documents and artifacts hidden, the story untold. And then, by chance and archaeological curiosity, it was revealed again. And what the revelation showed was this: the kamikaze pilots were not the fanatics of propaganda or the noble heroes of mythology. They were frightened young men trying to navigate impossible circumstances with courage and doubt in equal measure. They questioned. They feared. They loved their families more than they loved the cause. They wrote poetry in the margins of training manuals. They had photographs they weren't supposed to keep. They left small toys at shrines, hoping the gods might be merciful. They were, in short, human. And recognizing their humanity makes their sacrifice more tragic, not less. Because if they had been fanatics, we could dismiss them. If they had been eager for death, we could say they got what they wanted. But they were not fanatics. They did not want to die. They went anyway, pushed by social pressure, family obligation, military command, and the fear of bringing shame to everyone they loved. They went because refusing seemed worse than dying. And understanding this forces a more difficult reckoning with the nature of war itself. We cannot simply blame the kamikaze phenomenon on Japanese culture or militaristic ideology. We have to recognize that any society, under sufficient pressure, can convince its young to die. That the mechanisms of social control, of propaganda, of honor and shame, exist in every culture and can be weaponized to extraordinary ends. The tunnels at Nishiki stand as a monument to this uncomfortable truth. They are preserved not to glorify kamikaze, not to condemn them, but simply to show what happened. To show how young men were prepared for death. To show what they thought and felt and feared. To show the gap between official narrative and private reality. To show, in short, the human cost of war in its most direct and undeniable form. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.